The snow had been falling steadily since noon that Christmas Eve, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, the world looked like one of those snow globes my grandmother used to collect. I had been working late again, finishing up some last-minute reports before the holiday break when my phone buzzed with a text from my wife Sarah asking when I would be home. The house was full of family, she said, and everyone was asking about me. As I stepped out of my car, the cold hit me like a wall. Even through my heavy coat, I could feel the bite of the December air. The temperature had dropped dramatically since morning, and the weather report had warned of a brutal cold front moving through. Walking up the front steps, I could hear the sounds of celebration coming from inside, laughter and music, and the clinking of glasses against the backdrop of a crackling fireplace. My brother Tom had driven up from Phoenix with his family, and my sister Margaret had flown in from Seattle with her husband and their teenage daughters. The warmth hit my face as I opened the front door and stepped into our living room. The Christmas tree stood in the corner adorned with ornaments collected over 30 years of marriage, each one holding a memory, the Mumsiki. Fire was burning bright in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Sarah rushed over to greet me, her face flushed with excitement and perhaps a glass or two of the good champagne we had been saving. She wrapped her arms around me and whispered that she was so glad I was finally home. Tom raised his glass from across the room, calling out my name and making some joke about bankers working too hard during the holidays. Everyone laughed, and I found myself swept up in the warmth and joy of being surrounded by the people I loved. Most Margaret was curled up on the couch with her daughters, showing them old photo albums and telling stories about our childhood Christmases. Her husband, David, was deep in conversation with Sarah about some book they had both read. The evening moved along in that comfortable rhythm that family gatherings have when everyone is relaxed and happy. We shared stories and caught up on each other's lives. The champagne flowed freely, and someone had put on the old Christmas records that my parents used to play when we were children. It was Tom who first suggested we move closer to the fireplace. The living room had grown crowded, and the area near the hearth seemed the coziest spot in the house. We all gathered there with our drinks and our laughter, creating our own little circle of warmth against the cold December night. I remember thinking how perfect the moment felt, how rare it was for all of us to be together like this in the same place at the same time with no urgent responsibilities pulling us away. That was when I heard it, a sound that seemed out of place among all the merriment. Something that made me pause mid-sentence and tilt my head toward the front door. It was a knocking, very faint at first, almost lost in the sound of our voices and the music, but persistent. Sarah noticed my distraction and asked what was wrong. I held up my hand, asking everyone to be quiet for just a moment. There it was again, more urgent. This time, a steady knocking that seemed to carry desperation in its rhythm. I walked to the front door, wondering who could possibly be visiting so late on Christmas Eve. The porch light had gone out sometime during the day, and I made a mental note to replace the bulb tomorrow. When I opened the door, I found myself looking down at a small figure hunched against the cold. It was Mrs. Henderson from 3 houses down, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else. Her thin gray hair was dusted with snow, and she was shivering violently in what looked like a housecoat and slippers. Her lips were almost blue, and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely speak. "Mrs. Henderson," I said, rushing to help her up the steps. "What are you doing out here?" She looked up at me with eyes that held both embarrassment and relief. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. "I locked myself out," she said. "The wind blew my door shut when I went to get the mail, and I cannot get back in. My phone is inside, and I have been walking around trying to find help." The temperature outside had dropped to 31 degrees according to the thermometer by our front door. She had no coat, no proper shoes, and from the look of her, she had been outside for some time. Without hesitation, I called to Sarah, who appeared at my side immediately. When she saw Mrs. Henderson, her face filled with concern, and she began helping me bring our neighbor inside. The contrast between the bitter, cold, and our warm house seemed to hit Mrs. Henderson all at once. She began shaking even more violently, and I could see that her fingers and toes were dangerously cold. Sarah immediately went into action, bringing blankets from the hall closet and, guiding Mrs. Henderson to the chair closest to the fire, Tom jumped up to help move furniture, and Margaret began making tea in the kitchen. The celebration that had filled our living room just moments before took on a different energy. Now, everyone focused on making our unexpected guest comfortable and warm. David offered to call someone about getting into her house, but Mrs. Henderson explained that she had no family nearby and her spare key was hidden somewhere she could not remember. Her neighbor on the other side had moved away months ago, and she did not know anyone else well enough to call. As we wrapped her in blankets and helped warm her hands and feet, Mrs. Henderson began to tell us what had happened. She had been feeling lonely on Christmas Eve, she said, and had decided to check her mail, hoping for some cards from distant relatives. The wind had been stronger than she realized, and when her front door slammed shut behind her, she discovered that the automatic lock had engaged. She had tried everything she could think of to get back inside, but nothing had worked. For over an hour, she had walked up and down our street looking for lights in windows and signs that people were home. Most houses were dark, either because families had traveled for the holidays or were celebrating elsewhere. She had been getting colder and more frightened with each passing minute when she finally saw the warm glow coming from our windows and heard the sounds of life inside. As Mrs. Henderson warmed up by our fire and sipped the hot tea, Margaret had made her story began to sink in with all of us. This woman had been out in dangerous cold for over an hour, while we had been celebrating just a few hundred yards away. The realization hit me with unexpected force. How many other people might be alone or in need while we were gathered in our comfortable bubble of family warmth? Tom must have been thinking along the same lines because he quietly asked Mrs. Henderson if there was anyone we should call to let them know she was safe. She shook her head, saying there was no one who would be waiting to hear from her Sarah, and I exchanged a look that conveyed everything we both were thinking. This woman was spending Christmas alone, and had nearly suffered serious harm from the cold, while we had been laughing and drinking champagne. Margaret came over and sat beside Mrs. Henderson, asking about her family, and learning that she had been widowed for 15 years. Her children lived across the country and rarely visited. Her closest friend had moved to a retirement community the previous spring. As the evening progressed, our Christmas celebration naturally evolved to include our unexpected guest, Mrs. Henderson, began to relax. As warmth returned to her body and color came back to her cheeks, she shared stories about the neighborhood and how it had changed over the decades. She told us about Christmas celebrations from years past when the street had been full of young families and children. Tom found himself fascinated by her stories about the local history, and Margaret discovered that Mrs. Henderson had been a school teacher for 40 years, retiring from the same elementary school where Margaret had taught before. Moving to Seattle, David managed to contact a locksmith who agreed to come out later that evening to help get Mrs. Henderson back into her house, but she seemed in no hurry to leave our warm gathering. The children, who had been somewhat subdued by the serious nature of the situation, began to warm up to Mrs. Henderson as she shared stories about teaching and asked them about their interests and activities. What struck me most as the evening went on was how naturally Mrs. Henderson became part of our family circle. She had arrived as a stranger in distress, but within a couple of hours she was laughing at Tom's jokes and offering Margaret advice about dealing with teenage daughters. When the locksmith finally arrived around midnight, all walked Mrs. Henderson back to her house to make sure she got inside safely. Her home was small and neat, but felt cold and empty after the warmth and life of our gathering. As we stood in her living room making sure everything was in order, Mrs. Henderson turned to us with tears in her eyes. She thanked us not just for helping her when she was in trouble, but for including her in our celebration. She said it had been the best Christmas Eve she had experienced in years. Sarah immediately invited her to join us for Christmas dinner the next day, and Mrs. Henderson accepted with obvious joy. Walking back to our house through the quiet snow-covered street, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically the evening had changed what had started, as a closed family celebration had opened up to include someone who needed not just physical warmth, but human connection. Back in our living room as we finally began to wind down from the evening, Tom raised his glass again, but this time, his toast was different. He spoke about how he had been reminded that Christmas was not just about celebrating with those we love, but about extending that love to others who might need it. Margaret added that sometimes the most meaningful moment